Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Dr. Richardson. Most people call me Doc or Don. I've been working in the scrub now for about 40 years. And today I'm hoping that I will be able to shed some light, maybe some different things that you didn't know about scrub. And we're going to start off generalized, and then we will end up talking about the Gladys Douglas Preserve and what we should or should not do out there, and some of the difficulties in managing that piece of property. So, but I'd sort of like to say congratulations to a colleague, Eric Menges at Archbald Biological Station, who just retired in June and has done a wealth, just a tremendous amount of work on scrub all through the Lake Wales Ridge. And kudos to him. He's had a long 33-year career and has done a wonderful job. So let's start. Scrub ecosystems. Everybody knows that knows scrub by a different name. 99% of the scrub is endemic to Florida. There is a little patch of scrub that occurs in Alabama. And it occurs in many different variations and types. We have basically sandpine scrubs that have typical sandpine with an oak understory. We have rosemary scrubs that are dominated by rosemary, just like what you have at the Gladys Douglas site. We have oak scrubs like Merritt Island, where there's no trees. It's pretty much nearly all oaks. We have coastal scrubs like the West Coast and the East Coast, Atlantic Coastal Ridge, where they are younger scrubs. As you know, most of the Central Ridge, the Lake Wales Ridge, Ocala going north, those scrubs were out of the water for a longer period of time and are older, so they have a different suite of species. So, and then if you're familiar with white versus yellow sand scrubs, a good place is like Jonathan Dickinson State Park, where you have St. Lucie fine sands that grade into these yellow sands right within the park and at the park boundary. So scrubs vary depending upon isolation and where you find them. So the classic example, and a lot of this is going to be stuff you've already heard, but we want to make sure we talk about it briefly so that when we get to the talking about management of the Dunedin site, we have a good understanding. Classical scrub is 3-layered. It's got a canopy layer of sandpine as the dominant. It has scrub oak understory that varies from 2 to 7 or 8 feet, depending upon the burning regime. And then it's got a herbaceous layer, but that herbaceous layer is restricted mostly to gaps in the canopy or gaps in the oak and along the edges or disturbed areas where the woody species are not dominant. And in this picture, you can see the oaks in the foreground and the sandpine in the background. As you know, or if you don't know, there's 2 species of sandpine. Ocala sandpine, as I call it, which occurs in the panhandle or in the peninsular part of Florida. And then as you get into the panhandle, you get the other variety, Choctawhatchee, which has open cones versus sandpine in Peninsula Florida, which has serotinous cones. Serotinous means they open with fire, whereas the Choctawhatchee sand pine and the panhandle, they're dropping seeds all the time. So I want to talk about some different scrubs now, things that you probably maybe haven't seen, haven't ventured out up there, but this is a panhandle, typical panhandle scrub close to the water. You can see all these patches of West Coast lupin, and scattered in the background are isolated shrubs of rosemary. And then sort of where we would be sitting is the demarcation between these open white sand areas and the forested or oak canopy. In this case, no Choctawhatchee here. This site is actually up by Port St. Joe in the Panhandle. And one of the interesting things is you'll notice that you notice the isolation of lupins and how they are sort of scattered about. Well, there's some work being done now, and we'll talk a little bit about that, about allelopathy in the lupins and some of the and rosemary. So here's West Coast or Gulf Coast lupin. You can see how this plant differs a little bit from the species we have here versus some of the ones on the Central Ridge, which have speciated due to isolation. Here's a good example of rosemary. This happens to be at Rosemary Beach in the Panhandle. I don't know if you've ever been there before, but if you, from Port St. Joe all the way up to Destin and going around the corner there, you'll find rosemary growing out on the dunes, right with sea oats and other grasses. And then you will be able to see the gradation of the beach environment that's real sandy as it transitions into the more oak scrub as you get closer to the roadway. I think that's 98 that runs along the Panhandle there. Here is a typical St. Lucie fine sand Lake Wales Ridge scrub. This particular tree you see right here is about 68 years old. And a lot of these oaks here, which are Quercus inopina, another species of scrub oak, this particular forest is really due to burn. And we're going to talk about burning and the frequency of burning that's necessary. But these white sandy areas here, you can see on the left side of the picture, there's like a trail and there's some offsite roadway stuff here. People have been going down this trail now for about 55 years, and that trail has become consistent with the environment, meaning that woody stuff just won't grow on it. It's a very sensitive, very nutrient deficient, xeromorphic, xeric plant community that requires long-term fires. Now here's one of, this is up in Brevard County. This is a Rosemary Bald. You can see in the background the large sand pines that most of those are about 45, 50 years old. On the left-hand side, you can see rosemary. And then if you'll notice, there's that little bit of clear area between the rosemary shrubs and the other scrub species. So what you have here is you have the woody species, which tend to be deep root, rhizome, rhizominous, and then you have these little, as I call them, herbaceous species, belly plants that occur in these white sandy areas that are obligate seeders. They produce seed, and after fires, you get a lot of germination. Here's another picture of a Rosemary Bald. that burned about 2 years ago. This is in the Sunray scrub on the Central Ridge, the Lake Wales Ridge. And you can see all the dead rosemary scattered about. A lot of the pines have burned up. 8 months before this picture was taken, it was almost bare white sand with a few sticks sticking out. And you can see in the 8 months, it's resprouted quite well. But this particular scrub is no longer there. It's been bulldozed and turned into a housing development. Here's a classic Rosemary Bald in Sunray that's close to Archbald Station that was actually eliminated due to housing. But you can see the pattern. You have scattered scrub oaks, lots of rosemary, lots of bare sand. And in these areas, these areas are utilized by scrub jays and other species that like these bare sandy areas, particularly the obligate cedars, the herbaceous species. They're great in the gaps and tend to do quite well. I put this in because almost all of the scrub are found on old shorelines. And this particular picture is the distribution map for sand pine. And you can see that on the East Coast, you have Brevard County, Atlantic Coastal Ridge. Up the middle of the state, you get the Lake Wales, Ocala Ridge. On the West Coast, we have West Coast scrub. We get up into the Panhandle and a little bit into Alabama. But almost all the endemic species track these old shorelines. It's just, obviously the scrub has probably the largest percentage of endemics in the state of Florida. And you can see its distribution somewhat. Okay, so scrub plant community, species composition, dominant plants, diversity relationships vary in space and time. Majority of plants have extensive root systems. And so what does this mean? What we have here is the woody components: oak scrub, scrubby flatwoods, sandpine scrub. These areas are dominated by above ground biomass of woody species that have extensive root systems and store a tremendous amount of reserve below ground. Why? Scrub burns every 40 to 50 years. And when it burns hot. So it burns the above ground biomass right off to pure sand, and they resprout easily. In the gaps, which are the areas where we don't have the woody species, most of those plants produce seed. And those plants give off lots of seed material. And it's not until you get a fire that this seed bank actually germinates and recolonizes these bare areas. And part of what I found so intriguing is, I'm going to tell you a little story about how I got into scrub and what portion of scrub I really like. I was out in California looking at the chaparral. It was about 1982. I had just started the Ph.D. program a year before that. And somebody showed me a picture of the chaparral from the air. And all of the chaparral species were spaced out with these bare zones in between them. So I took that picture and I compared it with an aerial view of Sunray and the central Lake Wales Ridge. And you can see the same kind of spacing. Well, that intrigued me as to what may be causing those bare zones. So what I ended up looking at was the ecotone between the high pine, longleaf pine, sandhill, and the scrub. And if you notice, look, if you've ever stood between those two plant communities, the herbaceous species of the high pine come down and sort of dwindle and sort of disappear as they come up to the scrub. So it was my philosophy that what was happening here was an allelopathic response. So that's what I decided to do. Well, the committee thought I was absolutely crazy because nobody knew about allelopathy much in those days, particularly in the scrub. And they just didn't want to accept that a plant would give off chemicals to reduce competition or space around it. And that's how all this started. And so you'll find that as we go through some of the pictures of the plants that are out in the preserve, these obligate cedars produce thousands of plants. One of them, which I have a picture of, is Bonamia. And they drop literally thousands of seeds that resprout following fires or disturbance where what we think are allelotoxins are broken down from fire or from disturbance and allow these species to germinate. So in many scrubs throughout Florida, rosemary is an indicator. If you've all driven the scrubs of Pinellas County and even of Hillsborough, rosemary is in decline. Two reasons. One, it dies of old age. Most of the plants at the Gladys Douglas site are about 25 years old. They don't live much longer than that, and they need to burn. They're an obligate cedar. If you'll notice, at certain times of the year, you'll see these little yellow seeds on the rosemary. And it was Dr. Ann Johnson who was looking at rosemary for a while and figured out how to germinate them. They take several years to germinate, but you can actually take the seeds, dry them out, put them in some pouches out into the scrub. And if the conditions are right, 2 or 3 years later, you will have baby rosemary shrubs starting to resprout. And you can see down at that bottom right picture, you can see where right next to the rosemary, there's that bare zone, which is due to the release of allelotoxins. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So let's talk about some of the plants that are out at the Douglas Preserve that are also common in good scrubs scattered around the state. This is nodding pinweed, Lechia cernua, which is a protected species. It's a gap specialist. It only occurs in open sandy areas, and they're relatively small plants, maybe a foot tall. But when you find this, which does occur at the Dunedin site, it implies that the site is of fairly good quality because there's a lot of endemics that only grow there. Another Lechia that's found out there that's also listed species is Lechia divaricata, dry sand pinweed. It also occurs out there, and it's not a real flashy. I didn't have any pictures of this, so I had to check around with all my friends, and nobody ever takes a picture of it because it's just such a diminutive plant that it doesn't do much for anybody. So there's been no pictures taken. But it's also fairly common in the Rosemary Bald part of that scrub. One that was real common in Pinellas County, Garbaria, scattered along the coast, is Garbaria heterophylla, which is also a listed species. It's a shrub, and it's pretty, but due to, I want to say, fragmentation, development, pedestrian foot traffic, a lot of these plants that were prolific at times, like rosemary was historically, have disappeared and you find them in clumps scattered about. This is typically what you would find, and you'll see this out at the Dunedin site. There's scrub lupin, there's a lot of cladonia, reindeer moss. You know, that I never did, we didn't do a thorough study of the reindeer mosses, the lichens. So it may be that you may find Florida perforate cladonia out at this site. I just don't know. It's in such that good a quality that you may find it out there. Another one that's a real pretty plant is Curtis milkweed, another protected species. Sometimes you'll find it in the open sandy areas, but it tends to like to grow right up along that scrub oak interface. It likes to, it's a short diminutive plant, doesn't get very tall, but really pretty. And one that we do have, we had out at the Dunedin site. Now, a lot of species, you know, it's been over 15 years or so, almost 20 that did this report, and some of these species just may not be there because I don't think that site has burned at all. This is one of my favorite plants. I did a study of, wrote a paper with a professor on this particular plant. This is scrub morning glory bonamia, also a protected species. Produces lots of seed and lots of ramets, particularly after fire. At some times in the Lake Wales Ridge site, open areas will be covered with this particular plant, which is really a beautiful thing to see. And here is here's just a little comparison of the lupins. On the left is the Gulf Coast lupin, which we have on, that we see a lot in the Panhandle and around the bend. And then we have sky blue lupin, which seems to be the common one. And as you probably know, that, you know, historically, meaning Pleistocene type years ago, when we had a lot of interbreeding of species, it was continuous from north to south in the area that was exposed. But over time, due to sea level rise, fragmentation, isolation of scrubs, speciation has occurred, and many of the lupins, here's two of them, and then we have Lupinus aridorum in the central ridge. We're starting to see that they become isolated, and we're getting new species. And the same thing is happening with some of the mints that occur in the central ridge, where you go from one little site to a next, and you could have two different species of mints. So it's a rather unique system, but I found that even though a scrub may be small, it could be as small as a lot, it can still harbor the same species mix as sites that are 5 times the size. it seems that a lot of the, as long as you don't have a big exotic invasion, a big edge to core effect, usually those species will persist a long time. I showed this slide because cactus, typical in many, many, many scrubs, all different kinds. But next to the cactus, you can see sandspike moss, Selaginella, another good indicator species along with lichens. So when you start seeing Selaginella, you know you're getting into an area that has low disturbance. And I didn't want to, I have thousands of slides of plants, but most everybody has heard enough scrub talks about plants and liatris and calaminthas and conradinas, all which are, endemic to the scrub and are all pretty mints, but you could go on forever about that. But I put this picture of the Florida gopher tortoise in because it is a keystone species and it does occur at the Gladys site. The unique feature about gopher tortoises is that the commensals and other animals that use the burrows. So you could have, depending upon water, you could have Florida mice, you could have gopher frogs, you could have indigos, you could have rattlesnakes, you could have armadillos, you could have a whole slew of animals that utilize the scrub, and gopher tortoises are one of these species that sort of constantly disturb the areas around their burrows. And as a result, they form gaps for a lot of these obligate cedars to come up during and after fires. And it wouldn't be right to talk about scrub without talking about the Florida scrub jay. Obviously, we don't have Florida scrub jay at the Gladys Preserve. However, it would be nice to at least think about including in some management practices habitat that may be inducive for immigration or relocation or whatever of the Florida scrub jay. So this species here is dependent on, as you know, open sandy areas to cache acorns. They have to be able to cache acorns. And I've been monitoring about 5 populations, about 13 or 14 birds over the last 20 years. And their numbers fluctuate depending upon how invasive the scrub oaks are and the amount of fire, because when the oaks exceed 4, 5, 6 feet in height, it's now no good nesting habitat for scrub jays. They like it. They like low oak scrubs that they can fly in. They like a few sand pines around or other larger trees that they can use as sentinel trees. And, it's a unique bird because the whole family stays together until there's a food shortage or something that forces one of the offspring to leave the group. But the offspring and the parents raise the young. So it's really a neat bird to, and if you haven't been out to the Central Ridge or where there is scrub jays, go out with some unsalted peanuts and stand there and call them in, and they're really fabulous birds. Okay, so what happens to scrub? If scrub is a pyrogenic plant community that requires burning every 40 to 50 years. Now, many of you have been probably to Archbald. I always like to say Archbald is an anomaly in the scrub system, only because as a research station, they have burned a lot of that scrub quite often, 5, 10, 15-year intervals. And their burn plan is actually pretty good for the large area they have. And they try to, and one of the things they try to do, and everybody should do when you're talking about burning versus mechanical versus preserve, is to say, what do we have there? What do we want to keep? And what fire management rotation works best for a particular species? So hurricanes and fires are great disturbance features in the scrub. Many of you, if you've ever were around when Hurricane Donna or some of the other hurricanes brushed across the state and just took these sand pines and broke them right off at the ground. But like all of the scrub, the woody scrub, very little species turnover or replacement because they recover from these tubers, large root systems. And I didn't put a slide in because I tend to get off track when I put this slide in, is when I was looking at rosemary and how allelopathy works with that species and the scrub, I decided to, I convinced the local fire department to bring a fire truck out to one of the sites on the Lake Wales Ridge. And we decided we were going to blast away all the sand from a bunch of rosemaries to see what the root system is. And for a typical 3x3 rosemary shrub, you have roots that go out 3 to 4 meters all around this plant. And it's only 4 or 5 inches below the sand. So you can see the potential for allelopathy to work in these very dry, sandy, nutrient deficient soils. This is one of, this actually is typical of how the scrub burns. This picture was taken at Jonathan Dickinson State Park. I think it was taken in the 70 or 74 fire that jumped A1A. They have usually canopy fires, and you can see how the canopy fire usually burns quicker on the top than the understory oak layer. But I did a prescribed burn using a head fire in the Amato scrub in Boca Raton way back in the 80s, and actually with Dorn and Dick Roberts actually wrote a fuel model for burning. And we had fire trucks on every building, and we burned, and it looked just like this. So it was a little scary. We didn't have any smoke issues. We had the wind right. So, but they are spectacular fires when they do burn. So let's get now and talk a little bit about the Dunedin site, the Gladys Douglas Preserve, as I call it. It might be the Gladys Douglas Park or however they're going to call it. But we published a paper in 2013 called The Last Remaining Rosemary Bald in Pinellas County. And at the time, Jackie Hall was a graduate student working on a master's. And she heard a talk that I gave and got so excited about GIS and scrub that she decided that she wanted to do a paper, her master's thesis on scrub. So that's how this paper came about. And we did this, we had talked to the caretakers on the property. They said, hey, if you're not going to do anything unique there, go ahead, have at it. So we published this paper. And here's a recent aerial, just took from Google. And you can see in the sort of central area of the central portion of the aerial, the white sandy area that looks like a little oblong egg there, that's actually the Rosemary Bald. And then you have sandpine scrub around it that transitions into flatwood and other species. So that Rosemary Bald was unique because almost 50% of the ground is covered by rosemaries. And at the time, most of those rosemaries were 25 years old. Now that was almost 10 years ago. So this site is going to need some kind of management in order to sustain it so that it doesn't become overgrown. Here's a look at the interior portions. You can see the rosemary and scrub oaks in the understory. You can see there's various ages of sandpine, meaning that some of those serotinous cones, which are closed, get heated up during the summertime without fire and do drop some seed that does germinate. So it's a really, really unique site. Here's another picture, and you can see the gap. See, this is what we refer to as a gap, and this is where you'll find those obligate herbaceous cedars like lechias and silkgrass and licanias and lichens and all these species. But you can start to see the predicament we might have in doing management. And so management issues in this scrub. One of the first things that you have to do when you're setting up a particular site as a preserve, I've done many. Lynn University has a 15-acre preserve. We created about 6 acres of scrub there. There are just lots of Yamato scrub, there's gateway scrub, there's just all kinds of scrubs that require management. But the very first thing you should do, and I think you guys are actually starting to do that next week or the week after, is to come up with a list of what do we have. Now, when we published this paper, we had roughly 20 species that were found in the bald and 30 species total in that scrub portion. We didn't do the flatwoods and the edge effect and all that. So once you know the species that you have, you then have to make a management decision on what do we do with this site? What do we want to do with this site? And this is where you need to adopt a management plan. A lot of counties they buy these sites. They don't know what to do with it. They don't have any more money. Nobody's going to look at them. They sit there, and because of edge effect, turn into exotic thickets with just a little bit of scrub remnants. So in our case, if we're looking at the Gladys Douglas Preserve, you have gap species, open areas of protected species, lots of them scattered all through that Rosemary Bald. Obviously, that should be something that should be high priority. We should say, okay, the next question is, if that's a high priority, how do we manage it? Now, do we burn it, or is there a way to do some mechanical? For the Gladys Douglas site, burning obviously would be the best protocol. Now, I know most urban settings, most cities and municipalities do not like to burn anymore because of just the sheer number of people around. But in our case here, if you were to mechanically hydroax the understory of the flatwoods and the surrounding area to the bald to reduce fuel loads, you might be able to do a burn, a winter burn that's cool in the rosemary area, which would stimulate the germination of new rosemary plants. And why am I saying this? Is because most scrubs, which are scrub oak, mechanical works fine. And I have some pictures. You can go in there, grind it all up. 6 months later, it's back where it was. However, that doesn't work well when you have rosemary bald. One, soil disturbance. If you get in there with a tractor, you'll mess it all up and it'll stay disturbed forever. So I did send an email out to Eric at Archbald, who's now retired. I didn't realize that until I sent it out, asking him, because I've seen some of the burns of the rosemary balds at Archbald, but I've never seen anybody do any mechanical, excuse me, other than the actual physical removal of the bush, or using like a propane torch, like you would go ahead along fence lines and torch underneath the wire. That they tend to burn up the rosemary, and you could, because you only have an acre or so, it may take you a week to do it, but you could actually physically go in there and remove it and or burn it. So the question becomes, how often do you have to do that? Well, the data right now suggests for Ceratiola, which is rosemary, long-term intervals, longer than 20 years. If you start doing them more frequent, you then eliminate the obligate cedars, the endemics, and you go to a more natal grass and other exotics that tend to move in. And the next, you can see in the next thing, plants or animals should drive the decision-making. In our case, we don't have scrub jays, but we do have a few gopher tortoises. So, but we have a lot of endangered endemics that occur in these gaps. So we would want to structure our management plan. Now, remember this, that a resource management plan is two parts. It's usually an in-depth survey of the plants that are there, so that anybody who picks up the management plan can say, we're managing for this suite of species. The other thing that's real important is exotics. If you've been out to the site, and I'm sure most of you who are listening to this probably have been out to the Dunedin site, you'll notice that the edges are Brazilian pepper and a lot of exotics. I always say that after a purchase of any property, the county, municipality, private, whatever, should go through and remove all the exotics, eliminate the seed source that becomes critical when you're starting to do management. So if you get at it right away, and then once you have those eradicated, you can then determine how you want to go forward. What's going to be the long-term goal for this park? Now, based on the few parks that I've actually set up where I've cut trails and put in placards and done all that kind of stuff, this park is really only set up for passive use, meaning one loop trail, maybe with a small observation deck and a few areas of parking, but it's not going to be used for anything more than that. That's my opinion. Because, and in many cases, some municipalities buy these sites and say, okay, we're just going to set it aside as a preserve. But what usually happens in 90% of the cases is that the county buys it, they don't have any money, they can't do maintenance, the maintenance gets put off until they come up with some funding. 15, 10, 5 years go by, and the exotics have damaged the site to the point where it now requires a lot of money to make it worthwhile. And this gets back to the bottom, you can see there, where we talk about restoration. I personally have created about 15 to 20 acres of scrub using tree spade and nursery grown material. It's very difficult to do. You have to be really diligent about how to utilize the soils in the right way, and the volunteers, and how it should be planted. Now, out at the Douglas site, there's a lot of edge effect that could be restored, and a lot of sandpine scrub soils on the corner, particularly, that would be the southwest corner, where you could essentially remove the bahia grass and other things that are growing there and actually replant with some scrub species as a place for maybe a parking lot of 2 or 3 cars. So, but you could plant scrub stuff around so that you don't have this bare area stuck out there. And then, so you could then utilize that corner as additional scrub. And maybe in the future, these are areas that people could actually actually plant things there, have the Native Plant Society or the garden clubs who say, okay, I'm going to take this little piece and I'm going to put scrub oaks and liatris and other things that would be conducive to the West Coast scrub. So I think that is where I want to end. I'd like to take some questions if you have some, but you can see that if there's a take-home message here, you have a very delicate, imperiled, xeromorphic plant community dominated by rosemary that will need some attention in the future. And it will need possibly other things other than burning. So it's going to be real important to get some feedback from the researchers, if they're particularly those people who have studied Rosemary Balds. And I think I'm going to leave it right there and just open it up for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Richardson.
Thank you.
So we do have a couple of questions already, but while we're talking to you about those questions, if any of the rest of the members have questions, please remember to use your chat and make sure it's set to everyone so that we can get as much feedback as we can. One of the first questions, sir, was, do the woody plants' root tubers ever become overwhelmed by salt inundation during hurricanes that damage plant tops?
I would say in less than 1 or 2% of the sites. If you go over to the East Coast for a lot of the coastal scrubs, followed by some of the hurricanes, you can see areas of overwash. But what happens is that the salt actually, either the wind first may strip the leaves off, but secondly, as the new leaves start to come out, they tend to be yellow. They will actually fall and sit there for a while, maybe 2 or 3 months before they start to put out new growth. And usually 6 months later, you never miss a beat. It'll be right back to where it was.
We did have a good comment from Debbie Chiat. She mentioned that smoke management is a huge issue on the site. Could you give us a little bit more information about that?
Well, anytime you're going to produce a fire model for burning, you have to consider smoke. And in all the sites that we were managing on the East Coast, we had US 1 and 95 as our border roads that we had to worry about. So in when you write the fire model or a prescription for burning, you have to look at the weather, the direction of the wind, lots of factors so that you don't push smoke from your burn onto 95 and create a traffic problem there, or vice versa onto US 1, or in your case, just the county roads that are around the site. In addition to that, there's also the problem of letting people know who live around the site that you're going to burn, because many of them have allergies or negative responses to smoke. So usually we go out and not campaign, but usually put flyers out on all the houses that are around the site when we're going to burn, so that people know that there could be some smoke. And if you have a problem with smoke in your lungs, etc., stay indoors until we finish burning. So there, yes, you have to really pay attention in the fire management model on where the smoke is going to go and what time of year you want to burn. Remember, most fires in the scrub burn from May to August. Very few fires occur in the winter, but there are winter lightning strikes. So if you want a head fire that you're going to try to burn it to the ground, then smoke issues are going to be a real challenge. If you burn a cool fire in the winter, those fires burn slowly across the ground, and they usually don't produce a lot of smoke, or is not as much smoke. So these are all things that you're going to have to take into account when you actually write a management plan for the site.
Thank you. I'm sure I'm going to massacre this word, but some people would like you to define allelopathy.
Okay. So let me tell you what I found in looking at my research. When I started to see these bare zones or clear zones around rosemary, I also started to see them in the polygolas and chrysomas up in the panhandles, somewhat in the lupins. Many of these species were producing chemicals, and that we call those allelochemicals, allelotoxins, that are released by the plant through the leaves or the roots. They accumulate in the soil. And my theory was that these chemicals build up in the soil to reduce the fuel load so that the plants don't burn but once every 40 or 50 years. So when you look at that ecotone between the high pine and the sand pine, and you see these bare zones, you'll see that right after a fire, the allelochemicals are broken down. Those grass species tend to start invading into the scrub. And it's not until rosemary sends up new plants that the allelotoxins tend to start building up in the soil, and then they sort of eliminate those species. So there's been a lot of research rosemary, it's the prime chemical there is ceratiolan. It's released into the soil. There are many other terpenoids and other allelochemicals from other species like Calamentha and Conradina and Polygolas that are given off into the soil. And if you'll look at the white sand scrubs of Suriname or the chaparral, many of the species there are in the same family of plants that give off these allelotoxins. And they do pretty much the same thing, but just different species. And that's what it is.
Thank you very much. It looks like, I believe that's the last of the questions, unless I've missed one. I don't think I have. I think I've got them all.
Well, I want to say that I hope maybe I've touched something different that you might be able to use, or at least provide some references if you need it. If you go to my website, Florida Scrub, you'll find complete bibliography of all the papers, just lots of cool things there that might help in the future. So I thank you. Thanks for having me.